A facilitator is an expert, and he is an expert for the process.
Hello to a new episode of the Days of Change podcast. Today I have a bunch of topics I want to touch upon with my guest. I would like to explore with her the art of facilitating and then branch out into theory U and maybe some other frameworks for change. Let's see where we end. I believe I know something about those subjects, but I have no clue at all about other topics that my guest stands for, which are related to different spiritual worldviews, or as she calls it, cosmologies. That's something I usually keep a healthy distance from, but as you dear listeners know, I'm always curious to learn new things. So I'm really excited about that. Before I introduce my guest, let me say a few words about this project, the Days of Change podcast. You might have listened to other episodes, and if you haven't, you can find them at changedays.com/podcast. I started this project, like many others in my life, out of pure lust. Lust is one of my major drivers. The original idea, which still holds true, was based on the fact that over the last 2 to 3 decades, I've met so many great people who have something to say about change. All people who have grown through life and developed their own cosmology. Yeah, I used a new word, Barbara, which I've never used before. What I want to say, those are people who have spent probably half of their professional life teaching or training or facilitating or managing, and the other half thinking and designing and experimenting. With this podcast, I want to give them a voice and to learn from them, and I want to understand their personal path to where they stand now and maybe where they plan to proceed. I'm still experimenting with the forum, and until episode 13 I had a lot of different sections, including one about their favorite music and another one about books that had an impact on my guests. And yes, some of you listeners, you like them a lot, but with time I realized that those sections, as much as I love them as well, were cutting too much into the time for the actual conversation. So I decided to skip them and just have a conversation as such. So if you want to have them back, write me. And I know it's difficult to give feedback because you hear the podcast on different platforms. But if you want to give feedback, probably the best platform is LinkedIn, where I regularly post announcement about this podcast. So maybe you just write a comment there in one of these announcements. My name is Holger Nauheimer, and I'm happy if you connect with me on LinkedIn. So that's enough about me and the podcast. Are you still there out there? My guest today is Barbara Zuber. Barbara is a woman of enormous presence. You should see her. You should see her eyes and her gaze, which is super sharp. She's a great teacher and a role model in whatever she does. Barbara is part of the School of Facilitating in Berlin, about which we'll talk later in the show. I have some more biographical data at hand, and Barbara's and my path have crossed quite a few times over the years. But at the end, I know little about her, and I'm really curious to explore her. Her motto, as published on LinkedIn, is something like, "Solutions may be simple." And I'm really curious to find out more about this special person and to understand the way she reflects about life and our profession. Barbara, it's great to having you on the Days of Change podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Holger. What an introduction. That's so flattering. I really enjoy that.
I'll try my best.
Okay, that's great. No, it's really lovely to be here, and it was so fascinating to prepare myself for this interview, because I realized I don't really look back so much into my life.
Barbara, what's your strongest personal driver? Why do you get up in the morning?
I think I have 2 drivers, and one is freedom and the other is curiosity. And I think life is so fascinating and we know so little about it. So it's so much you can be curious about. Mm-hmm. And yeah. Freedom is also, time on earth is not so very long. And I think it's very important to give yourself the freedom you need to explore whatever is possible.
Yeah, I like that. And I know we are about the same age. Actually, you are a bit older than I am, but just a little bit. We shouldn't mention our age, but I mean, we come to an age where, I mean, we see that our time, as you say, is limited. I mean, that's very limited now, but still, I mean, I see that the same way. There's still so much to explore, and let's go for it, right?
Right, absolutely.
Let's start to unveil who are you as a person, and visit some of the landmarks you have crossed on your path. Where should we start? I mean, how much back in your history should we go, or what was a starting point where something changed for you, where you understood something about life and moved into a certain direction?
I think I really had a really boring life, actually. Not really boring, but I finished my school. I went to a different town. I studied English literature and linguistics and geography and God knows what. It was a nice and fascinating time. I did my teacher's degree, diploma. I was almost married to a guy who was owning a company. So all seemed to be set quite nicely, and my parents were happy. And then I fell in love with somebody much younger than I was, and he drew me to Berlin.
Okay. When was that? How long ago?
It was in 1984.
Right. Okay.
And I had always wanted to do theater work, and so my excuse was I went to Berlin to study theater and education, which I did at the HDK. And so this love affair didn't last very long, but it, catapulted me to Berlin. And then I got another invitation, and that was an invitation to join the German school in Mexico City.
Did you speak Spanish at that time?
No, my sister, she had just moved to Spain. So I had a few lessons with an American guy who was trying to teach me Spanish so that I could visit her, but it wasn't very much. And and I didn't know anything about Mexico, nothing at all. And this was within 4 weeks. I had everything packed, had everything given up, and went to Mexico. And I went with 2 suitcases and everything else I had sold, because in the background of my mind, I was deeply convinced I would never come back.
Really? But you came. Yeah, but you came. You came back.
I came
How
back.
long did you stay?
2 years.
I know there are a lot of experiences that you made in that time, and later on you traveled also to Peru, and I want to give them a special section later on in our show, because obviously these journeys had a big impact on you. But let's come to those a little bit later, because this is obviously connected to what I announced before as your special way to look at spirituality. Tell me, how did you get into the facilitation business then?
I worked as an NLP trainer, and I had an NLP institute in the 90s already. And then I started, I've started quite a couple of companies actually. Then I started another company, people who came from the consulting business. And we were the first in Berlin who would do outdoor trainings. So we had our, these parks where you can climb up trees and you do mohawk walks and jump from the pamper pole and all this kind of stuff, which was really fun. It was a great time in my life, because you earn money while standing in the sun, watching people and giving feedback.
Just out of curiosity, and we never talked about that, Barbara. That's quite interesting what you're saying now, because I was deep in the NLP scene in the 90s as well. Studied with Ulrike Harlander. Maybe you remember her. She died a long time ago, and then later went to see Robert Dills, who I'm still seeing. I mean, after 25 years, just like 2 years ago was the last time I was with him.
And Robert Dills was one of my longest teachers.
Okay, so you had these different businesses, you provided NLP training outdoors, and then
When you do outdoor, we did a lot of outdoor team training. And what you do when you do outdoor team training, that you watch the people and you give feedback on the group dynamics, on the performance of the group, where you see where they have belief systems that are being difficult. And so this was really a great training field for facilitation, because what we did was facilitation. We just didn't have the word for that then.
yeah, that's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I started facilitating 25 years ago as well, and also at that time I didn't call it facilitating because I was very much in development aid business, and there, at least in the German context, they use the word moderating, and it's still used in German from time to time, and now it's more and more replaced with facilitation or facilitating. And let's talk about that a little bit, because I think I didn't have another show so far where we really talked in depth about facilitating. Let's start with the word. Actually, you call your institute School of Facilitating, and you know that I was disturbed very early by that, because usually we would use the word facilitation and not the gerund. Facilitating, it sounds a little bit kind of unusual or awkward to me, although it's obviously grammatically correct. So why did you decide to call it School of Facilitating, which is obviously the doing, than facilitation?
And that's why we chose it. I mean, you already mentioned it.
Okay.
We wanted to make it explicit that it's about acting it out. It's not a noun. It's not. It is. It is sort of for us. It's very much is attitude and doing.
Okay. That's interesting. Let's stay a little bit with the word, and I hope we are not boring too much our listeners, but it's interesting because recently I gave a short introduction to facilitation to some public servants in Sudan, in Khartoum. That was just some weeks before Bashir was overthrown. And I was talking that for me, facilitation is giving room. And actually, I always joke, I say, what I do is I make other people work. Which is partly true, of course. I mean, a good facilitator does very little, as we know from Marvin Weisbord. It just stands there and does nothing if he's at their best. And it's interesting because they said, wait a second, Holger, because in our language, a facilitator is somebody who has the knowledge and the answers. And I paused myself for a moment and I thought, yes, because when I'm giving training in an international context, I also call that facilitation, although, and of course it has elements of facilitation when I give training. So the word is not as clearly defined. So let us have your definition. What is facilitating or facilitation? What does a facilitator do?
A facilitator is an expert as well, and he is an expert for the process of collaboration, for the process of conferences, for the process of team workshops. So he has a lot of knowledge and experience in accompanying people and finding their own ways. With this knowledge, he really goes on a journey goes on a journey with the customer or the client or whatever you call it, because neither of them know the result. So you know the direction, but you are open in this journey for what emerges.
Obviously, not every client gives you that as a job description when you start to talk with them, but I agree very much with you. Some clients have, at least before they start the process, very clear views on what they want to achieve as results, right?
Mm-hmm. Then it's the question if facilitation is the right method that you would use. And of course, I'm not just a facilitator. I can also do consultant work and coaching and training and moderation and lead a group towards a preset goal. But my idea is, and that's why we founded the School of Facilitation, is to make clear that, this is the job and this is the journey. And right now we are in the process, where every company needs suddenly to become different, modern, agile, whatever you call it. Nobody knows the route. This is unknown territory. And so facilitation becomes even more important, because what the client needs, he needs to trust the facilitator at his side, that he can be a good companion for this journey to the unknown.
Yeah, and I understand what you say. And I probably, in my work, I'll be a little bit more pragmatic. I totally agree with what you say as the ideal of facilitation, of opening spaces, operating, as you say, also in your book, which I will mention also in the show notes, operating at the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious mind, opening spaces, holding spaces, and things like that. And I think it's a continuum. And I catch myself from time to time, if I'm facilitating a meeting where I'm very passionate or very knowledgeable about the subject, that I jump between pure facilitation and also giving some expert advice. For example, in Sudan, the whole meetings were about networking, and I call myself a networking specialist. So, but I try to make that explicit. So if I'm together with a team, I would say, okay, wait a second, I'm leaving my facilitator's role now and jumping into the expert role. Do you do that as well?
This is exactly how we do it as well, and how we teach it as well, as because why should you keep back, when you have an idea, or you can contribute in a very constructive way. You just have to make sure, it doesn't mean that the client has to take it. So what we say is, you can make proposals, or you can say, I have an idea here. How it could be like that and that, and then you see, the client says, "Oh yes," or the client just looks at you, and then you should forget about this topic, because when you go with the flow, if they take it, okay. If they can't take it, it's not yet ready.
You mentioned the getting into the flow quite frequently, also when we talked before, and I really like that, because this is why I love the job. And yesterday somebody asked me what I like most at my job, and I said actually facilitating, although I do a lot of training and consulting and coaching and things like that, but I really love facilitating, and I love this feeling of getting into the flow. Can you try to describe this getting into the flow with some words? Is it a feeling? Is it an unconscious kind of state of mind? Or how do you know that you are in the flow as a facilitator?
That's a good question. It's a feeling that things are, when you're really in the flow with the group, and the group also is in its flow, then it's just the right words come, the right ideas come, the right questions come. It's like the exercise that you have planned, or you wanted to do, is really sort of ready. It's almost like the group was knowing that you would do this kind of exercise, and so it just all gets together, and everybody is surprised by what comes out of this, and how easily it goes and works. And these are these sort of holy moments, where you say, "Wow, that was great." It is still exhausting, because it needs your whole attention. So after a day of facilitating, I'm flat on the ground most of the time, because you are alert, you are present, you have to think on different levels. You are with the group, and you have to think about what's the next step, and how am I going to capture this, and all these kind of things. You have to mirror back, and there's so many things you're doing in this job, and so it's quite an amazing. That's also lovely. It's so interesting. It makes it so adventurous to do this job.
Do you think that from time to time you go in a state of trance, or let's say in a semi-state of trance. So that's quite interesting for me because besides Robert Dills, my main teacher is Stephen Gilligan. So I have a lot of learnings about getting into trance, particularly when I go into coaching. I think I'm in a semi-trance. Would you describe it like that, at least in part of your work?
I think it's what is important to me is that you, before you go and meet the group, how you prepare yourself, and that you go in a certain state and that you set an intent.
Right.
So that you're clear about, what is important for me, what do I want for this group to happen, and how can I support them in that? And it's sort of you connect to the field. We call it you get into the facilitator state.
Right.
And it's so lovely about theory U. In theory U, you can talk to the universe.
Yeah. Let's talk about the theory in just a second. I was just thinking maybe before we go into that, I would really love to share maybe both our favorite stories of, let's say, failure, or maybe not failure, but stories where we thought, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into here? Do you have something in mind? Something funny which you want to share? Come on. I'll tell one of mine as well.
One of the biggest, most terrible failures was that I forgot some very simple steps in the beginning of the workshop, because the people came late. There was something in the company or on the road, and they came late. And I realized, we have just half a day and not the whole day. Half day is already gone, and so I really sort of jumped into the topic in the workshop. And I forgot to ask them, the normal things at the beginning, expectations, so what is important to you for this day, and all this kind of stuff. That's so important, to set the frame. Build the container. So I didn't build the container, and it flopped. It was so terrible. They just refused. They got absolutely not cooperating, not doing the exercises, not doing anything. And I was so stuck.
That's terrible. Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
And it's really like I never in my life again forgot to build the container before I start.
Right. Yeah. So my story, I have, of course, several stories, but I was just thinking what came to my mind was a longer process, actually, not only one workshop, but a longer process in an organization, in an international organization, where we basically built up the spirit and the morale of the people and helped them to regain pride in their craft and things like that. So we had a series of workshops, mainly applying appreciative inquiry, and they worked out a lot of good proposals for change. And their bosses weren't present. The bosses were in general quite supportive for the process, and I hadn't briefed the bosses very well. So at the end, we had a presentation where the participants of the other workshops, and we all brought them together, presented their proposals for change to their bosses. And at least one of the bosses, if I remember it right, it's like 10 years ago, teared half of the proposals apart in front of the other participants. So yeah, there I learned, okay, if you do such a process again, please, they can discuss things later on and see how they go about it, but that was really frustrating. Yeah, it's about the same what you described. It was just the end that I didn't close the container correctly. Barbara, let's talk about Theory U, which I think probably most, if not all, our listeners know, but let's at least for the few who don't know it, mention that it's something that has been developed by Professor Otto Scharmer from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it has influenced a whole generation of facilitators. I mean, I really know very, very few who don't know it, and most of them take reference sooner or later in their work. I mean, I take reference to it, not every time, and I wouldn't say all of my work is influenced. It's rather the other way around. For example, recently I had a workshop with a management team, and I realized at the end of the first day, the evening of the first day, that wow, we have reached the bottom of the U. And that wasn't planned in that sense from me, but it was very clear that the process needed this point. And I shouted, yay! And they really looked at me very strangely, because it was quite a depressive moment that I had to say, sorry that I just shouted yeah, because I said we reached an important point now. So this is Theory U, Barbara. I know it's important for you. And what does it mean for you?
Theory U has put many, many things together that I had sort of loosely apart. So to me, it became a framework where I could put in all my tools and methods, and it gave my work a new form. It's like a research journey. How does perception work? What's triggering and what's driving our perception, and what's hindering our seeing things, or when you go into sensing, and it's all about emotions and feelings, and how does it work? Is the biology behind that, and so every step at the U has become a research field for me. We've been working with the Theory U now for 14, 15 years. And, I'm a very curious person, but also I feel easily bored. And with Theory U, it's still exciting. Absolutely exciting. Because, the whole design thinking work that goes also to Theory U, and then the presencing moment at the bottom of the U, where you can ask yourself, where do people, get their power from, what's driving us, what's driving me, what's my purpose, all these subjects, you can find them easily back in the in Theory.
Maybe I said that most people will know it, but still we should give maybe a very, very short description of the essence without going into details. But if you would describe Theory U to somebody who has never heard about it, maybe has some knowledge about dynamics of organizations and about psychology, but never heard about Theory U, how would you describe it in, let's say, not more than 10 sentences?
I used to work like in NLP, you go from A to B. You want to go from A to B, and you see there is a gap, and then you have to fill the gap. But sometimes filling the gap is not enough. So you have to go on a deviation road. And the U, in German, it's Umleitung, or Umweg. So the U really transport the sense of the word deviation. And you do this when you have to go through a deeper transformational change. Then the Theory U does make a lot of sense. It helps to bring future or something new into the world. And I love this metaphor that Otto Scharmer uses. The Theory U, you want to become a landing strip for the future.
As we said at the beginning, you lived in Mexico for 2 years, and in recent years, you have traveled twice to Peru, and you have obviously made some very deep spiritual experiences there. In our briefing, you said you are influenced by Inca, Maya traditions, Taoism, but also a group of people that I have never heard of, the Q'ero. I looked it up in Wikipedia, which says that's a Quechua-speaking community or ethnic group dwelling in the Cusco region of Peru, just 600 people, and it also says 6,000 llamas and alpacas. Tell me, how did you get there?
A friend was organizing a workshop here in Berlin with an NLP trainer called Tom Best. And Tom did a 2-day workshop on training the energetic muscle. And I had never heard of that before, and I was curious, and I went to this workshop, and he did a lot of exercises with us, sort of about the exchange of energy and about how to connect to nature and energy. And this opened up a totally new door to me. So, for example, whenever he was teaching us, whenever you see something where nature is catching your eye because of the beauty you see or the light that's there, you should stop and really take it in and connect yourself to this phenomenon and enjoy it, like a rainbow or whatever, that you not just pass by, but that you really take it in. And this has made my life much more lively. And I feel much more connected to the things around me and much more watchful for that. And Tom was organizing a trip to Peru that started 6 weeks later. But I just went. And this is also, when life is calling you, suddenly I felt such an urge to go there, and it felt so right to do this. And this was from one moment to the other, really. And I came back and I felt like another person. When you come into contact with indigenous people, and you join them in ceremony, and you see how they are connected to each other, and how they are connected to nature, and how they, how they live what we are trying, what quantum physics is trying to tell us, everything's full of information, and information flows everywhere. We just are not open to see it or receive it. For them, that's everyday practice. They live it. And they are, it was so amazing to be in the presence of these people who live a very, very simple life. I mean, they're poor. They even in winter, they don't wear shoes. They live in 6,000 meters and more. They have survived the conquista, and they went up into the mountains to survive as a culture. And the mythology goes that in the 1950s, the first Cairo came down from the mountains, and everybody was amazed because they didn't know that they still existed.
Power up before we go further into the mythology and what it means to you. I'm usually quite appreciative in this podcast, but let me be a little bit provocative, because I actually checked the website of, I would say, the spiritual tour operator whose services you used. And yes, it looked fascinating, but I got a strange feeling like what the hell is this? Saturated white people being carried to a very remote place to visit people who have lived in peace and harmony with nature, but undisturbed from the buzz of the world. And it looked a little bit like, yes, we are pampering white people and we are disturbing people who have been living their life. Have you ever had this kind of thoughts while you were traveling?
When I was traveling, that was in 2006. Peru was still a little bit different country. Not so many tourists were there then, and the person, the guide who introduced us to the Cairo, was someone who had been grown up with them, so he felt very familiar with them. He spoke Quechua, and at the same time he felt like he was a bridging person also to the culture of the West. To him, it was important that the two become connected, because it's about, when they say it's about the time, and this is why the Kairos also came down from the mountains, because they were beginning to open up to share their knowledge that they had kept for such a long time.
Okay.
And yeah, and it's about, sharing about their form of being connected to the earth, of nurturing the earth, of, there is sort of a little ritual. Whenever you eat something or you drink something, you spill a little bit on the earth to sort of give Pachamama, which is Mother Earth in Spanish, in their language, to just show that you are aware that it's a give and take.
you talked about the person who took you there and who's obviously connected and speaks the language. Did he ever think about that? Again, what I just said, bringing white people there and making that connection could be, of course, a big risk to the integrity of those people, as we have seen with many other indigenous people who have been, let's say, spoiled by Western cultures. I mean, I'm not a social romanticist, so I don't think the world shouldn't change, and particularly also people in remote areas will change. But did he ever talk about this risk?
Of course, there is a huge risk, and you can't turn it backwards. Sort of, you have to
Right.
do the best with this, because also the Cairo people, they want to have electricity, they want to, they love watches, and they love their iPhones, and they have all this right now. And since they have shown themselves, to the rest of the world, they want to participate in with this world. What's really awful of what's happening right now is that some people sort of take people from the Cairo, pretend them or sell them as Pacos, and bring them to the West, bring them to the United States or to Europe, and then they to sort of become part of seminars, and they are not accustomed to the food. They get ill. Some even died, and I thought, this is really terrible. So it has become an industry, and that's awful.
Well, that's really awful. Actually, I'm just reading a very fascinating novel, which I really want to recommend to you or to anybody. It's called "The People in the Trees" by Hanya Yanagihara, and it's a fictitious story about an anthropologist and a doctor who traveled to an undiscovered tribe in the Pacific Ocean, and it's sobering. But anyhow, so Barbara, tell me maybe towards the end of this story, what of the things you learned there, and obviously you also studied Maya culture and other cultures, but what of the spiritual practices you learned there, well, you mentioned a few already, are very important for you, and which do you integrate into either your life or your teachings?
What for me personally was very interesting is that I have a different view on spaces. When we were traveling Don Americo, he was the guy who was leading us on this journey. He went with us to certain so-called holy spaces. Could be old temples, caverns, maybe sometimes just a rock, or something that was to the indigenous people. They knew there was something about this. And what was fascinating to me is that all these spaces triggered within our Westerners, triggered certain topics. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when we went to Pisac, everybody who had trauma was confronted when we would go into these spaces and meditating, sitting down and trying to connect here and spending some time there. And it was so amazing, to see that certain topics were triggered, and different topics in different spaces. And I found this very fascinating. And so to me, looking for good spots in nature when I want to think about something, I'm more conscious about, where do I go with this thought or this question that I have right now.
Very fascinating, and you gave me again a wonderful transition, because spaces is the topic of this year's Berlin Change Days. If any of the listeners don't know what the Berlin Change Days are, this is an international event, a festival for people who are curious about change. And we do it every year in Berlin, and since last year also every year in Toronto. You will find the information on our website, berlinchangedays.com. And as I said, this year it's about spaces, about inner spaces, about outer spaces, and about cyberspaces. And this will be something where we explore, I think, exactly the concept you just mentioned. How do spaces impact on us personally and on the systems we are working in? And I wanted to ask you, Barbara, as you have been many times at the Berlin Change Days as a facilitator and as a participant, to give us a short description of what's your experience and how would you describe the Change Days from a participant's or from a facilitator's view?
It's one of these conferences that's really inspiring because you bring together so many different people. And what I also like very much about it, that is, it's always a common room. I mean, we always meet all together, and different people facilitate through a session where you meet. So you have the chance to meet so many different people in quite an interactive way, and always gay. Whenever I'm a very introvert person. So after 3 days of Change Days or any conference, I feel, it was a lot. But it's so nice to be inspired and to feel inspired and meet so many very fascinating people. It also has a very international touch. I like that.
Yeah, it's an amazing tribe, isn't it? Barbara, that was a wonderful conversation, and I got so much inspirations from you, and I continue to getting inspirations from you. And thank you so much for spending that time with me. I always learn a lot from this conversation, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Holger, for inviting me and for having me here. It was lovely. It was nice. I really enjoyed it.